Good to go?
Yeah, I gotta fix the camera.
Hey everybody, it is Thursday night. That means it's time for Matt to leave
I'm just gonna fix
the live stream. It's Thursday night. That means it's time for AMA, Ask Me Anything. My name is Pete Baker. We're with Alta Vista Assembly in beautiful bucolic East Bakersfield, California. And joined tonight by Pastor Chris of New Wine that meets at the very same address. And also, as always, I'm joined by Matthew, the moderator. I don't know what all you do.
You say a lot of things, and half of it I don't even know what it is.
Engineer, producer, you
Like
do a lot
bucolic?
of things, huh?
Like bucolic, yeah.
I know you're stumped on bucolic, but I say about you that you're the laughable, affable, jovial commentator. You're the man about town, bon vivant. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, not
Look it
really,
up.
but
Look it up.
Okay, I'll Google it.
Anyway, we're joined by Matt tonight. Matt, do your best not to mumble through the introduction. Greet the people and tell them how we play the game.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. The way it works is you submit your questions in the comments, and we'll read those first. You can also submit them via our website throughout the week. We have some submitted that way, and that's kind of how it works. It's not too difficult. So if you have a question, you can submit those. The ones that are left in the comments, we'll read those live before anything else.
You get priority. So, what you got for us tonight, Skippy?
Okay, so we're going to start off the first question, and then...
It's always good to start with number one.
I got to find it. Who were the Stylites?
Stylites.
Stylites. That was close.
Comes from a Greek word that means column, pillar, post, an upright. Long about the 4th century into the 5th century, a little bit into the 6th century, it was a little bit of a fashion among some eccentric Christians in the Eastern Mediterranean primarily. They were what were known as stylites. One of the most prominent, one of the best known, was a fellow they called Simeon or Simon Stylites. He was in the area of modern-day Syria, which is in the news all the time now. In fact, there's bits of a monument to Simon Stylites put up by some of the Eastern churches in the city of Aleppo in Syria. Anyway, what he and others like him did is they would climb to the top of these columns that had been left standing. Maybe the rest of the building had deteriorated, but a post was left standing, a column of some height. And they would get on top of that little platform and they wouldn't come down, like for the rest of their life. And they committed themselves to prayer and to fasting. Some of them, they were sort of a version of hermits, except that most of them, not all of them, Simon, though, was among those, that they felt like part of their mission while they were up there, people would gather, who wouldn't, to look at this guy that hadn't come down for 30 years. They would talk to the people, they would preach to the people that were gathered at the foot of their column. And he did that for a number of decades, died up there. A number of them did the same thing. It became kind of an in vogue thing for a little bit. They lived out in the elements. If it rained, they got rained on. If the sun was bright, they got burned. Now, obviously, they had to have people to help them live that lifestyle, so they would haul up baskets of food or water or whatever they needed. That's basically it. That's what a stylites was.
They probably needed buckets.
Use buckets because somebody had to take care of the waste products. So you think about it as a solo act. It really wasn't. It required, a few good friends to help you live that life.
But the idea basically was to be closer to the sun, right?
Yeah.
More scorched by the sun, more closer to the elements.
They were
more,
intentionally open to the
open
elements.
to suffering.
Yeah. They were intentionally bringing hardship on themselves by living open in the elements like that for several reasons. And in this, they're not a whole lot different than some people that practice extreme forms of what they call mortification. And they get the idea, at least the Christians ones do. There are people that practice this sort of.
I got the picture up. So
Yeah, there are people that practice, this kind of self-torture almost for their faith.
Is it the icon that you have up?
I have the icon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the famous ones.
Okay.
Some of these people have become saints in the Eastern Church, and very prominent, and people still make pilgrimages to the places where they were.
There was one they had to coax down or something like that. He was up there for so long that something was wrong, and so they had to convince him there was some meeting that wasn't really a meeting, just so he would come down.
Yeah. I mean, there are all kind of stories. There are all kind of,
So the
hagiographic
point was
stories
to be
like they
closer
were.
to the sun, or
to
is
be
it to put
to be.
yourself through some sort of
No, it's more closer to suffering.
make yourself
Is a
uncomfortable?
better way to say it.
They wanted to suffer. They were trying to intentionally intensify their suffering because they felt that this was part of their mortification. Now, I started to say they're kind of in league with some people that been known by various names, but the flagellants, people that in the practice of their faith, they whip themselves. And this practice is not confined only to Christians. There are Christians who have done that in the past. There's still Christians that do it today. There have been people in Judaism that have done it, although not as many. They beat themselves with a whip. It's called a flagella,
Flagellants.
and they're flagellants. They're flagellating themselves. They're whipping themselves.
Right.
Punishing themselves.
And there are people within Islam that do the same. Now, I've got to say that Islam, it's not much practice in Judaism today. There used to be Jewish people that would do it on Yom Kippur. They would beat themselves with a whip. That's very, very, very rare today. But there are people in Islam that do it. There are still some Christians that do it. There's even evidence, good evidence from his own testimony, that Pope John Paul II would occasionally practice that. And there are people in other places, Christians, that do. But in Islam, it's just as controversial as it is in Christianity. So I don't want to give the impression that there are a lot of Muslims that are doing it or that it's sanctioned. It's largely looked upon as very controversial. But what they're trying to do is mortify their flesh. Some of the Christian people that practice this and have practiced it, they claim to tee off of verses like Romans 8:13, where Paul says that you have to mortify your flesh. The word mortician, mortuary, comes from that word. It means death. You have to kill your flesh, or your flesh will kill you. But what Paul was talking about in 8:13 of Romans, very simply, was if you don't do this, you will die. In other words, if you don't kill your sin will kill you. But he said, it goes on in 8:13 of Romans, but if by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live. And so it wasn't intended to be this dealing with our sin, wasn't intended necessarily to be something that we were the drivers of. That's a work of the Spirit. The Spirit will deal with the sin in our lives. But anyway, they teed off of verses like that, and as Chris said, they had the idea that the more I can cause my flesh to suffer, the better it is for my soul. And so extreme fasting, doing without water, obviously if you're on top of a post like that, you're not exercising, and they would atrophy and all of that. And age early and all sorts of things. But they did it on purpose to increase their suffering with the idea that I'm paying for my sins, or it's purifying me, or it's purging me. All the while misunderstanding that is not part of the gospel. So,
what about the people in the Philippines who around Easter time go about crucifying themselves?
that's a modern day.
extreme.
That's a modern day version of it.
That's a modern day equivalent of what we're talking about.
It's
Of
not just the
people on the
Philippines.
stylites, of the people beating themselves with whips, and in some of those cases in the Philippines and a couple other places, there is the flogging. You do the self-flogging.
And it was popularized in the Da Vinci Code. The villain kind of monk in the Da Vinci Code.
And there are evidences that among some Jesuits in years past, it was practiced, even encouraged. And there have been cases. Martin Luther practiced it. He beat himself with whips. But it's all really an understanding of the whole picture of the gospel. I don't pay for my sins. I can't pay for my sins. If I beat myself every day for 100 years, it still wouldn't do anything, regarding my sin. So it's a misunderstanding of that. And to my way of thinking, it's really a dishonoring thing toward the Lord. A lot of people look at these people that practice these extreme measures as they're more holy than. I think they're just mixed up.
One of the things I would like to say, I think it's a misunderstanding of spirituality, Christian spirituality, as a whole. Just so everybody knows, I'm not checking text or anything on my phone. But I was looking up a passage of scripture because I forgot my Bible in the car, and I came here right before we started. Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, he says, I want to know Christ and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death, so that one way or another I will experience the resurrection from the dead. And a misinterpretation of that passage would mean that in order to be able to experience the resurrection, I have to suffer. And so that's where asceticism comes from. It's the idea that I have to suffer in my body in order to be fully alive spiritually. And generally, and I just want to give the ascetics a little bit of credit, these are not people who are trying to enter heaven based upon the idea that I can earn my way there. I mean, some of them may have fallen into that trap, but some of the original people, like Saint Anthony, for instance, who was not part of the Stylites, but was, definitely an ascetic who believed that, like Paul says in another place, I have to beat my body into submission. I mean, there's a story about him being on a tower. He's a desert father before the pillar stuff with the Stylites. He says, he's up there and a maggot is crawling on him, and he picks up the maggot and says, here, my child, God has given you this flesh. I mean, it's gross, right?
Yeah.
But I kind of blame this on biblical interpreters. And I don't mean, from the first century. I mean, 400 years in. They translated from the original writings the word flesh as sarx. And, I mean, that's the best they could do, but sarx means flesh. And so human beings took sarx to mean that it's just your body. So your body's the problem. Your human, vehicle is the problem. But that's not really the problem. The problem is our will, our heart, our ego, the thing that gets in the way of doing what God wants. All of Paul's writings were probably pointing towards that. And a lot of what he said was probably metaphorical based upon the idea of the Old Testament writings, the book of Proverbs, all kinds of different wisdom literature that essentially pointed towards the idea that, for instance, if you read Romans 8 about the sinful nature, you can apply that same idea to Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, where it says, don't trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. I mean, it's the same idea that Paul was promoting. And that's the idea. We want to die to the notions within ourselves to go in the wrong direction, not our body. We're not supposed to beat ourselves in submission.
Right.
Now, Paul could have meant a whole bunch of things, and there could have been a whole lot of motivations as to why he used the word sarx, which means flesh. It could have been because he was beat up. Paul essentially gave his life for the gospel. He was always beaten, stoned, everywhere he went, shipwrecked, all these different things. But what he's essentially trying to say is, I sacrifice my will. And you can see that in Romans 12 through 2. Or 1 through 2. He says, the only reasonable sacrifice is to offer yourself as a living sacrifice. But when you're whipping yourself and you're up on a pillar or a tower, you're basically saying that God's will is for me to die. But Paul says, I want you to offer yourself as a living sacrifice so that God can change the way you think. And in Romans 12:2, he says, once this happens, you will learn to know what God's will is, which is good, pleasing, and perfect. I don't think God intends for anybody to suffer. Sometimes suffering is part of the cost of getting to the life that
But
God's
you
called you
shouldn't
to.
seek it.
Yeah, but it's not something you seek.
Yeah.
And even the pursuit of happiness. There was a thing that Pete and I used to listen to when I was a younger pastor. I made him listen to it. It was like this old sermons to like these like hip hop beats. And I would take him somewhere and I would make him listen to it.
It was painful.
And he would love the sermons, but there was like a in the background, and he would hate it. But this guy from, I think, the Christian Missionary Alliance, I can't remember exactly, but he would say, is it God's intention for men to be happy? Yes. But as a byproduct, not the prime product. And I would say it in reverse. Is it God's intention for people to suffer? No. But in doing God's will, you may. Because you're going against the world.
When we talk about
We got to
these,
finish because we have 3 questions.
when we talk about these crazy stylites people and the flagellants and the whipping and the extreme mortification of the flesh for the good of your soul, that seems so distant, so weird, so bizarre, so otherworldly to us. But we kind of still have it today. There's a certain line of thought that says, my life will be more interesting if I focus on my misery. If I'm a miserable person, I will have a more interesting life. I believe you can have a very interesting life if you're a happy person. And I would rather be happy. There is no advantage in suffering like that, especially if it's suffering that you seek
Intentional
out.
suffering.
No.
Yeah.
Paul, for sure, and he wasn't alone in this, he was very upfront that in some of his religious practices prior to embracing Christ, that he had gone to the extremes. And he is very upfront about seeing the weaknesses in the way he had gone about his religion and all of the effort that he had made to make himself acceptable before God. He'd really put himself through the paces. And he shares that with us very, very freely. And he talks about how he tried to come up with a wisdom on his own, but it ultimately didn't work. And he talks about that really pointedly in the first couple of chapters, for 4 chapters really, of 1 Corinthians. But in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians, he says this. After he talked about, I tried my own wisdom, he said, but here's what I've decided. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. My problem with all of these extreme measures, even ones that maybe look laudatory or that we call them saints because of it, is that it's ignoring the power of the cross. And Paul says, I set all my wisdom aside, all my religious efforts aside, all my heroic athletics, spirituality aside. And I have decided that I'm going to know Christ and I'm going to know him crucified. Because that's the important thing. That's the valuable thing. That's the beautiful thing. That's the liberating thing. That's the thing. Not all these extra things. Jesus is of the same mind too, because he talks about how people can have a human-generated religion.
Yeah.
And his last best word on that is, you've ignored God's commands and you are more loyal to human traditions. All of these things that people have dreamed up for the betterment of their soul and the detriment of their body, all these extreme measures, it's all performative. There's still an awful lot of performative in Christianity today. It's all performative and it's all man-made. It's nothing that God had in mind. I just want to close with this. There's a great passage in Colossians that touches on all this. In Colossians 2, along about verse 20, it says, if you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees like don't handle, don't taste, don't touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with the use, in accordance with the commandments and teaching of men? These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. This stuff ultimately doesn't do you any good. All the man-made stuff. We need to stay away from the man-made stuff, whether it's Simon Stylites or the guys whipping themselves or a lot of the performative Christianity that we're seeing today. And we need to stick, like Paul says, with Christ and him crucified. We need to come back to the Word.
All right, so we got 3 questions that were submitted. So we got only a few minutes, so let's narrow it in, okay?
Okay.
Rein it in is what you mean.
There you go.
Land the plane.
First question, Pastor Pete and Pastor Chris, what do you guys think about drinking wine? Is it okay to drink alcoholic wine once in a while?
I'll let you go first.
Your church is named after wine, so you're
calling
the
me
expert.
wine, so
You know what? I'm sick and
You're the
tired. I'm
wine
sick and tired of
expert.
that generalization
The
right there.
wino
Um,
aficionado.
I don't think that the Bible strictly prohibits drinking wine or alcohol in general. I think what you have to do and I don't like to talk about an individual basis, but only because it's easier to talk about general, rules. But if wine is not a thing for you, then it's okay, as long as you don't become a drunk. And if you do, then you have to, re-examine, what you started doing. I think one of the problems that we have with any sort of rule in the Bible is there's definitely things that we shouldn't do. There's some things that we might be free to do. But if whatever we're doing becomes a master to us, then we have to examine that as a, not a freedom, but like something that we might have an allergy to. I don't know. That's my best.
But if you're drinking and it, say Pete's drinking and his drinking makes me drink, isn't that him causing me to sin?
That's another good thing to consider is what you do,
The impact.
or at least publicly, what you do might cause somebody else to feel like it's okay. Paul's wisdom against that is essentially that, if you have freedom to do something, but it causes a weaker brother, or I think the word that he actually used in the original language is a younger brother, or we could say sister.
Younger in the faith.
Younger in the faith. You shouldn't do it because that might cause them to fall into it. Now, he was talking about eating foods that had been offered to pagan gods. Paul's like, there is no pagan god. There's only one God. So if you're hungry, eat it. It goes back to even in the Old Testament. David is on the run from Saul, and they offer him bread. He's not allowed to eat. And they give him Goliath's sword, which he really shouldn't have been allowed to take. But it's basically like, God told you to do this, and it's all good. And if there's no other God but God, there's no defiled food. But if what you do pierces or violates the conscience of another person, then you find yourself in sin because you're causing them to violate their conscience.
Yeah, it's not about you. In other words, if you're a Jesus follower, It's about how your life impacts other people. And so you leave it alone, even though it's perfectly okay to do it. Paul said, if it causes my brother to stumble, then I won't eat it and I won't drink it. And that's the end of the story. There is no prohibition in the Bible about drinking alcohol. It does say don't get drunk in a number of places. Proverbs is full of it.
Doesn't it also say drink a little bit of wine if you're...
And they're in medicinal
so the
use.
Prohibition is don't indulge in drunkenness. So I only even interject because becoming drunk is not something that any human being can control. You can become drunk on accident, but drunkenness is a pattern of behavior that happens because you really like feeling that way.
Yeah. Avoid the altered state of consciousness
Yes.
for obvious reasons. A whole lot of trouble can come from that. But there's no prohibition against drinking alcohol in the Bible, except the drunkenness. Don't do that, because that will lead to bad things.
But I'd also say that his applies too.
Sure. Here's the thing. While there is no prohibition like that, we have to realize that the culture we live in, the society we live in, does not know how to handle alcohol. Proportionally, there are too many alcoholics compared to places like Europe or Canada, where most Christians in Canada, there's never been a thought about prohibition against alcohol. In many churches in the States, there has been. And the difference is Americans do not know how to drink. People drink to excess. People drink on purpose to lose consciousness or to have an altered state. And we have paid a great price for that. So while there is no prohibition against it, except for that prohibition about drunkenness, we've got to remember where we live. And it goes back to what Paul said. If my drinking causes somebody else to drink and then get in trouble, that's on me. The other issue is the science seems to be pretty settled that some people are predisposed to being an alcoholic, and you don't know that until you take your first drink. So there, to me, would be not a bad reason for staying away from it entirely, because you don't know until. So there's that. There's our society. There's the fact that we are an immoderate society. We don't do anything in moderation. We go to the limit with it, and that includes drinking as well. Different than other societies. But here's the last thing, and I say it from the perspective of somebody who's helped a lot of people that have gotten in trouble with it. I have, in all these years, I have never seen drinking help any situation, and I have seen it do a lot of damage. So you make up your own mind ultimately, but those are realities. Our society is an immoderate society. It does not help any situation, but it can cause an awful lot of damage in families, lives, and so on and so on.
I just want to add, I wish that this is an hour and a half live stream, because there's a lot of stuff that could be added to all of these subjects. And I mean,
me personally, I stay away from it. I counsel people to stay away from it.
Yep.
I think that one of the hard things about the question is, and I think it was a couple weeks ago that we talked about addiction, is that addiction always gets looked at as a principled dysfunction, because addicts are dysfunctional. But the reason why in the last few years, when mental health has become such a buzzword or important thing for people to talk about, one of the things is addiction is attached to so many different types of traumatic stress. And a lot of people, and why drinking is so bad for some people, is because of post-traumatic stress disorder. like, it's not something that people do because they're like, oh, this feels so good. It's because it alleviates so much of their pain.
It becomes a coping.
It's a coping mechanism. And a lot of people don't know how to deal with their pain other than, go to the one thing that helps them. And so, it's not just an enjoyment factor or like, hey, I just want to be the type of person that parties or something like that. There's a lot of people that I've met and have counseled and helped that they struggle because they have no other avenue. And I believe thoroughly that the church and that Christ is the answer to their problem. And sometimes the overarching effect of whatever their habit is, whether it's weed or alcohol or whatever, it becomes a blocking effect where they can't experience Christ because of what, they are indulging in.
And maybe we should, pick this up and kick it down the road again at another time. We come from a tradition that traditionally was very much discouraging people of drinking.
Even books about it.
There were books about it. There were sermons about it. I've never preached a sermon on drinking. I've never done that. I believe that when people come to the Lord, they will change, and if they need to change that He will transform that too. And I leave that up to the Holy Spirit. He doesn't need a little helper in me. So I've never preached on drinking or against drinking. A lot of people have. We come from a tradition that greatly discouraged it. But in the last, 2 or 3 decades, there's been a loosening up of that, maybe because we really haven't preached it or talked about it much, but there's been a loosening up. I know of many people, even church leaders in our tradition, that are social drinkers. But here's what I've noticed, just on a personal level. I can think of several cases where Christian people, faithful people began to they never did before, but they began to drink socially or at dinner or something like that, or at home or with friends. I call it play drinking. When you have gone your whole life and you've not been an alcohol consumer, and then all of a sudden you feel this freedom and you get into it, I call that play drinking. And they begin to play drink, and I can think of some tragic results. I know of families that have been fractured. I know of lives that have been jeopardized. I know of children that have been estranged from their parents, and ugly, ugly things that have happened because people they've been away from it their whole life. They haven't been part of that scene, socially or any other way. They've avoided it. And all of a sudden they begin to, as I call it, play drink. If that offends you, I'm sorry. But they begin to play with it, and tragic results. So again, I haven't seen it help anything, but I sure have seen it do a lot of damage.
All right.
What else you got?
I think Matt's playing us. It's like he has to know that these things he's adding at the end are.
No, you guys are just talkers.
They're
you
gold.
got a lot to say about it, so we got to get it out. And people are asking questions. We got to ask them.
Ask away.
We'll know right now how different this pivots.
All right, so quick, okay? You got to answer quick, under 2 minutes.
All right.
2 minutes each?
What does it mean to carry your own cross?
Okay, it doesn't mean that I'm living with a crabby mother-in-law or something like that. People have said
similar to people who hit themselves?
No.
Because you're I'm carrying my own cross. I'm beating my back all the time for Jesus.
Can I go first?
Go.
All right. Hey, so in Matthew 16, which is one of the most famous passages about Jesus telling his disciples to carry their own cross, Peter had just told him, after Jesus had told Peter and the disciples that he was going to die on a cross, he tells Peter essentially that Peter says, no, that'll never happen to you. And he turns to Peter and the rest of the disciples and says, hey, look, if any of you wants to follow after me, you're going to have to carry your own cross. But what a lot of people don't understand is that Jesus was talking about doing God's will. This is what God had sent him there to do, and this is what he was going to do.
So those guys who carry the cross around town and stuff, you seen that guy?
That's a
That's
prayer.
similar to
That's
these
a prayer
guys, aren't?
problem.
Isn't that similar to the guys who?
I hope God has led them to do that.
Yeah.
If not,
and maybe he has.
maybe it's an exercise. I don't know. But one of the, and I don't want to put them down. I mean, they're obviously serious about Jesus. The same way I wouldn't want to put ascetics down. You know, like those people believe that they were doing what God wanted them to do. I believe they're misguided, but it doesn't matter. They're more devoted to Christ than I am, because I would not be up on a pillar or any of those things beating myself into subjection. Maybe because I'm more enlightened, or maybe just because I'm not as devoted. But when Jesus told that to Peter and the rest of the disciples, he was essentially saying, you guys have to take up God's will for your life. If you're going to follow me, whatever God wants you to do, then that's what it's got to be. And you can see it later on after Jesus resurrected. Peter, after Jesus is resurrected, comes to Christ and is like, hey, I love you. And Christ challenges it on him and essentially says, hey, look, you're going to have to feed my sheep. And then he tells Peter what a lot of people, believe would be his ultimate end, which is that he would be crucified himself or led in a direction he didn't want to go. And Peter looks to John and says, what about him? And Jesus tells Peter, what does it matter about him? You come and follow me. So what Jesus is saying about carrying the cross is, you do what God has called you to do. No matter if it's suffering, no matter if it's
There's kind of a
happiness.
popular thinking, maybe it's a little bit in the past now, that everybody's got their cross to bear, and it could be some nagging problem or
Like you said.
crabby mother-in-law. Well, that's my cross to bear, whatever it is. Or it could be some physical thing. That's my cross to bear. That's not what your cross is. It's very easy to determine what Jesus is talking about when he says we have to bear the cross. If you think about what a cross does. If you were in the first century and you saw a man going down the road carrying a cross, there was one thing you knew. That guy is not coming back. A cross is where you die. What Jesus is conveying with this picturesque language, you have to bear your own cross, is not you die for your sin, but you have to die to yourself. When we become a Jesus follower, the idea is we'll be rightly related to God and rightly related to people around us. And the way we're rightly related to people around us, the Bible says, is you esteem the other person higher than yourself.
Philippians 2.
And that's what you've got to do. You put other people ahead of yourself. That's dying to yourself. And you got to do that every day. Paul says, I die daily. And that's what he was referring to. So,
Okay.
is that it
No,
for
we
today,
got one
Skippy?
more. We actually have another one. But we're going to save that one for next week. Final question for tonight. This one should be pretty easy, okay? Chris, you're going to like this one. And I'm just kind of...
Please tell me it wasn't what you said it was.
Is Trump the Antichrist?
Okay.
This isn't the first time we've had this question, too.
I don't know.
When we first started AMA, he was, right after we first started, he was president. We had this question, too.
Oh, wow.
He had a head wound and he survived.
We've been
so
doing this
he
for a
got
long
shot
time.
in the ear, so.
The simple answer is no, and I'm just not going to say any more than that. I really am not.
Hey,
And I'm not going to let you say any
no,
more
wait,
either.
just wait. I do have a biblical answer for that. In 1 John, now, there's no real evidence that John the Apostle wrote the book of Revelation. There's actually some, people that believe it was a guy who was a prophet at the same time called John the Revelator. But we do know in 1 John, the Apostle John, he says that there are many antichrists that have come into the world. And one of the things that we have to understand about that word, because I think a lot of well-meaning Christians who are biblically illiterate and don't read the Bible for themselves believe that the word anti means against Christ. It doesn't mean that. It means in place of Christ. And I think when John, in 1 John, was talking about that there are many antichrists that have come into the world, there are many people that will come into the world And I mean, honestly, all three of us are really young, even though you're the actually youngest, right?
Yeah.
We're really young, and we don't understand historically, as smart as Pete and I are, and you, don't understand the scope of history, that there are many people since Christianity started that have come along, that people have, just like, you know, with Samuel, that people are tired of listening to a prophet. They're like, we want the end to be here. We want the certain thing that we're looking forward to. And there are many people who have come along and tried to fill that place. Whether Trump is that or not, we have to always recognize, is somebody trying to replace Christ? Because if you're trying to replace Christ, improve upon what he said, improve upon the Bible, re-narrate it or translate it to make it go along with your ideals, we should be suspect of that.
And avoid. And we can also place things in this, we can slot other things in the place of Christ. I can do that as an individual.
Yeah.
I can elevate other things to that place that should be reserved for him, and that can run the gamut. It can be sports, it can be pleasure, it can be money, it can be relationships, it can be a lot of stuff. It can even be politics. Don't put anything where Jesus belongs.
He's the name of all names, the King of Kings.
One thing you always say when we talk about this is it's gonna, when end times, we are in the end times, but when those things start to happen, like the mark of the beast, you always say it's gonna be obvious. We're gonna, I've always said we're gonna recognize it. It's not gonna be like, oh, is this? No, it's gonna be obvious.
Well, it's gonna be obvious to the people who are looking for it, because, and again, I don't think you should be looking for these things, but I'm just saying, those who are schooled in it, you know, he who has ears to hear and eyes to see will be able to know what it is. But you know, one of the best things he's ever said about this is...
Me?
Yes. One of the best things Pastor Pete has ever said was, there is nothing that needs to happen for the end to come. It's already happened.
No.
All these things have happened in history before.
No. He can come anytime between the day of Pentecost and today. We've been living in the last days.
And that's the mark of the beast. That's all of the different things that people are, like, you know, speculating about.
It's already happened.
He could come tomorrow, and that's...
Nothing else needs to happen.
Nothing has not happened.
So, what that means is you can't get ready. You got to live ready.
That's right.
Hey, listen, everybody. Thanks for joining us over these last several minutes. We hope it's been beneficial to you. Thank you to everybody who sent in a question, even and especially those that sent them in live and in person. We appreciate that so much. As Skippy said, you can always drop us a question on our website, altavistaassembly.com, and there's a provision there for at any time, day or night. You can drop us a question. We'll get to it for the very next time that we get together, which should be next week.
We already have a bunch of questions from it.
Okay, we got a backlog. Well, again, thank you. We are with Alta Vista Assembly and New Wine, and we meet at 529 Crawford Street in beautiful bucolic East Bakersfield, California. And you would be welcome. 10 o'clock is the Alta Vista service in English. Chris comes back at 5 o'clock, also in English, same sanctuary. With New Wine, and then right in the middle, Pastor Ramon is with a Spanish language service at 2 o'clock. So it runs the gamut, and you'd be welcome at any and all of those. We live stream our Sunday morning, our 10 a.m. Alta Vista, and it drops at 2 and 2:15.
That's correct.
On the Alta Vista Assembly Facebook page and YouTube channel. And so you can catch that. Those are archived. We also post up our Tuesday night second look Bible study, a pretty intense Bible study that deals with some of the things that typically get overlooked, because a lot of Bible teachers and a lot of Bible writers, they want to protect us from our Bible. We don't need to be protected from our Bible. Just let it say what it says and deal with that. And that's what we do on Tuesday night. Anyway, and we do that at 6 o'clock, and it drops at that time. It is a live stream, and those are archived as well. So there are different opportunities to stay connected online, also live, whichever you choose to do.